Rich Heidorn is the editor-in-chief and co-publisher of RTO Insider and two other publications, ERO Insider and Net Zero Insider,
Correct.
which I learned about last night. I should have known. Rich is a former reporter and editor at the Philadelphia Inquirer, where he began covering the electric industry in Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and Delaware when they introduced competition in the late 1990s. So he's been through this entire 25-year ride with us. His coverage won the Natural Press Foundation's 1998 Award for Energy Reporting, and he's also worked for both Bloomberg and FERC as an energy industry analyst and has over 25 years of energy reporting experience. I'm going to start with our panel next and introduce Manny Cancel, who is the Senior Vice President at NERC and a CEO of NERC's Electric Information Sharing and Analysis Center, or the E-ISAC, to add another acronym if you're not familiar. Again, for all of you that listen to EPSA's podcast, which I'm sure many of you do, this one will ring a bell as Manny was featured on our most recent episode. We had an interesting conversation about the very real cyber threats that are facing the grid, as well as the constant vigilance needed to keep the grid safe from cyber and physical attacks. Before coming to NERC, Manny served as Con Ed's Chief Information Officer, leading all aspects of information technology, including cybersecurity initiatives. Manny earned his bachelor's degree in business administration from Baruch College and a master's degree in business administration from the Johnson School at Cornell University. Our next panelist comes from the U.S. Department of Energy. Winn is Deputy Director for Preparedness, Policy, and Risk Analysis at the DOE's Office of Cybersecurity, Energy Security, and Emergency Response. And I want to see your business card because there's no way that all fits in. Prior to her current role at DOE, Mara worked at the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, where she oversaw planning and collaboration activities focused on addressing America's highest priority critical infrastructure risks originating from cyber attacks. Her background is in the TSA, or the Transportation Security Administration, in the U.S. Department of Homeland Security, and U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services. She graduated from Smith College with a BA in physics, and then Dartmouth with a bachelor's in engineering. Wow. Last, I would like to introduce our senior advisor to Protect Our Power, a national non-industry, non-profit advocacy organization supporting best practices and investments in cybersecurity and resilience measures for energy, utility, and critical infrastructure industries. There is no way that is all on your card. Rick Mroz is a founding member and managing director of Resolute Strategies, LLC, senior director of Archer Public Affairs in Trenton, New Jersey, and Washington, D.C., and he failed to note it, so I will, that he is a former chairman of the New Jersey BPU. I'm not sure if he wants everyone to know that or not. So Rick also advises clients in the energy, utilities, infrastructure, and financial industries. And with that, Rich, I will turn this group over to you. Joe, oh my gosh, you're not on my BIOS list, so you must be really secret, and I apologize that I don't have it. So I'll let you introduce yourself.
My name is John Rovinski. I'm a senior supervisory special agent with the FBI covering the cyber division.
Thank you. Rich, the panel is yours.
Okay, thank you, Todd. Well, thank you all for joining us here today. We'll try and keep it lively. I don't know if we'll accomplish scaring the pants off, as Todd has suggested, but the threats are real. No one here would deny that, but I think they would also say that it's not for lack of diligence on the part of people on this stage and elsewhere in their respective organizations. You know, we hear about new threats seemingly every day, and I wanted to open with a kind of a broad question. What's the biggest concern that you have individually right now on this front, and is it domestic or is it nation-state targeted? Maybe we start with the special agent here.
If you're asking me right now, I think the most critical threat that's facing critical infrastructure and energy in particular is probably ransomware. We're seeing a rise in ransomware attacks, obviously not only from state-sponsored actors, but also domestic actors with political ideologies that differ from anyone else. So they're trying to, influence our political landscape by attacking critical infrastructure. We've also seen disruptions in, plots to take down grids based upon political ideology or some kind of grievance with environmental, concerns with the administration.
Manny, why don't you go next?
Sure. So I would agree, ransomware is a big threat, but I would throw that under the umbrella of just cyber threat, right? Ransomware is a type of cyber threat that affects critical infrastructure, and certainly over the last couple of years, and certainly over the last year, we've been seeing ransomware attacks attacking critical infrastructure, and specifically the electric power sector as well too. But the capabilities that our adversaries possess is really quite remarkable, right? They're persistent, they're stealthy, they know what they want to go after, they've been conducting surveillance for years, and so that's sort of what keeps me up at night, the potential impact there. That being said, I think the sector has been incredibly focused on this for decades, actually, and we have a plan, and we're working closely with our government partners and with the sector to sort of make sure we're prepared for a bad day. But the cyber threat, I think, is the most consistent threat.
Good, Mara.
Yeah, I completely concur with Manny on the cyber threat, and I think you're seeing that in the pushes that the federal government is talking about with the National Cybersecurity Strategy that was just released. Like, that is that emphasis of the importance on critical infrastructure for all of the cyber attacks. But also with the cyber attacks, it is not just concerned about a foreign adversary or a domestic adversary. You worry about also things that you are not prepared for, such as IT versus OT. A lot of our IT systems have been protected and are at the forefront, but OTs maybe has had a perception of an air gap. And we can't assume that anymore. As Manny said, there are pervasive surveillance and knowing our weaknesses, but also we worry about a combination. Supply chain is a big concern. And if we have climate threats affecting our systems and that is putting us at risk, how are we going to look at a physical and cyber combination threat, which is always a concern of ours.
Good, Richard?
Yep, so Rich, I'll answer the question slightly differently, which is I think the biggest emerging threat is cyber. And in particular, we heard a lot about it in some of the conversations earlier today with, no surprise, the continued digitization of this grid, the work that most of you all do here that is going to become highly digitized if it isn't already. I mean, cybersecurity is emerging and will be a greater threat. But, and I'll come back to the questions that were posed and answered by the audience, all of these threats, physical, weather events, cybersecurity, are all threats that everyone needs to be concerned about, and they are all emerging in different ways. And to the questions, a little bit surprising, maybe not, but people need to be prepared. And in a place like New Jersey, where I served as the chairman of the commission, New Jersey has had a long history of taking an all hazards approach to its critical infrastructure protection. That's what I would recommend that any enterprise, and particularly those in the energy critical infrastructure sector, need to be doing. Looking at the risks across all of these risks, all of these events, and figuring out how to protect their critical infrastructure.
Great, thanks. I want to return to the notion of nation-state actors. And first, I want to ask Mara, is your office often confused with CISA?
CISA is,
CISA?
and I think that's an important question, right? And first and foremost, just like with our FBI partners, when you reach out to any of us, you reach out to all of us, right? So should anyone have a concern and you reach out to whether it's Department of Homeland Security, FBI, Department of Energy, we always work as a team. But one of the things that CSER brings to the table is the energy sector expertise, right? As you know, an all-hazard shop, we are sitting with the energy sector when the hurricanes come through, when the physical attacks come through, when the cyber attacks come through. We are there as the emergency support function 12, in case you're a policy wonk. And we're the ones who answer the phone and do the coordination during response and restoration, which means that we're also the ones who are sitting at the table doing the policy work, doing the planning. And so that is why we are the sector risk management agency for the energy sector, whereas CISA is looking across the board at cross-functional risks. So we work very much in collaboration and partnership because we do know that much of the rest of critical infrastructure is dependent upon you all. And that cross-sector risk is very important. But also there's dependencies in your world on communications, right? There's very much an interdependency where if communications are disrupted, your operations are at risk. So that is where we are always trying to make sure that we operate to the best of our ability as one unified front.
Of course, in the last year or so, we've been, even before that, but particularly since the Russian invasion of Ukraine, we've been very concerned that we might see spillover from that conflict. The reason I mentioned CISA was Brandon Wales was quoted, who's the executive director of CISA, quoted in the Post earlier this month as saying the Russian invasion prompted greater cyber cooperation between the U.S. and its allies in Europe, particularly Eastern Europe. And I wanted to see if any of you agreed with that or disagreed with that. Maybe can add some color.
Yes, certainly it did prompt greater collaboration, and I would point out, again, getting back to how well or how seriously this sector takes the threat. As far back as probably October of 2021, before the invasion actually occurred, we were getting briefings from our government partners, both at CISA and at DOE, had got the sector together to say, look, this is real, this threat is real, here are the potential things that could happen. Made everybody revisit what had happened in Ukraine in 2015 and 2016 when Russia actually did disrupt electricity infrastructure there. So again, tried to get ahead of it as much as we could. Then fast forward into the actual invasion, recognizing that Russia could use cyber weapons to influence what the United States was doing or its allies in Eastern Europe. We shared a lot of information. So CISA highlighted and with DOE this malicious software that had been developed known as Pipe Dream, which was a toolkit to disrupt critical infrastructure, not only electricity. But again, good example of us working collaboratively with the government to get the information out, and then to start to monitor for those types of malicious activities and some of the sensors and monitors that we use across the sector. So again, not declaring victory, but sort of underscoring the need to, get ahead of things, continue to monitor and measure, continue to have dialogue, and think about how we continue to protect ourselves.
And I'll just add, I think there are a lot of lessons learned that we all, the sector, the government partners, the private sector partners across the board are taking and saying, this actually, the collaboration worked, we came together in unity. What do we need to do for a sustained effort to make sure that we don't lose all of that engagement, to make sure that the continued communication, the enhanced communication, the partnership on analyzing and understanding threats continues. And I think that's been a fantastic outcome of a challenging situation.
John, can you add any colors to this?
I would say the same thing. I'm in agreement with Manny and Mar. The collaboration works. It's important before an incident happens to have a friend before you need a friend, have a plan in place. And it's not just the collaboration, it's a whole of government, a whole of sector approach. That's the only way you're going to actually provide the security that we actually need. We've seen, the energy subsector of critical infrastructure used as a weapon in the Russia-Ukraine war, in the sense of taking out the power to force winter upon people as a means of putting forward a political ideology. That is not an isolated incident. The world has took notice, and so have we. We did start collaborating more closely together as a government and sharing more of the information that we've taken in with the private sector and vice versa. And keeping that dialogue going is paramount to making sure that we stay interconnected and provide the security that the grid needs.
Quote now Jen Easterly, who at CIRA Week earlier this month, who is the director of CISA, said the big threat we all need to be concerned about is China. Russia is the hurricane and China is climate change. I don't know if you have any context for that comments, but what is your perception of the Chinese threat versus the Russian threat?
Well, I'll start again, but every year the Director of National Intelligence publishes the Worldwide Threat Assessment. And for the last I would say 3 to 4 years, it's been fairly consistent that the sophisticated larger nation states, Russia, China, Iran, North Korea, absolutely possess the ability and capability to disrupt critical infrastructure here in the United States and to its allies as well, too. So, I think we have to accept that, right? And certainly in the context of China, and let's face it, there are geopolitical tensions there that we have to continue to monitor. The Chinese, again, have some very sophisticated capabilities that are similar and in some cases may exceed. We continue to see attempts to survey networks here in the United States, and what the Chinese are very good at doing is looking for vulnerabilities, looking for holes in networks so they can get in and introduce malware or just, poke around and see what they can steal, right? So very focused on espionage, surveillance, but also preparing, no doubt, for when they do need to use that for their own motivation or ideology, that they can do that. So obviously a threat actor that we take very seriously. We talk a lot with our government partners. We share information about activity we're seeing in that space, and just adds to the complexity of it. Yeah.
Yeah, my first thought exactly was the Worldwide Threat Report. I actually just sent someone an email referencing it today, saying it is some of the easiest to access threat information available to the public, and I could not emphasize more. As we know that all of you are challenged with trying to identify where you're spending your money, right? No one has an infinite amount of resources, no one has an infinite amount of time. So as you're prioritizing your risk management, where are you gonna put your capabilities? Where are you gonna put your time and effort? How are you going to prioritize that? It's a powerful document for you internally within your entities to take your own understanding and use it to influence your appreciation of the threat part of the risk calculation.
Rich, if I can convey a comment that was pretty powerful to me. I had done a program, something similar to this, with some energy industry leaders, regulators, and actually corporate board members as well. And the question to the group was, why should these business people care about this question of whether these nation state actors, China, Russia, Iran, are trying to do this to your infrastructure? And you know him, even though he comes from a different side of this business. Tom Fanning served as the chairman of the Electric Sector Coordinating Council, now the chair of the Private Sector CISA Coordinating Group. And his answer to my question was, why should these business people care? Why should the operators of these systems care? He said, and when he said it, I wasn't sure he wanted to say it, he said, because we're at war. And he said, they're using your infrastructure to conduct this war. That's why you all need to be concerned about it. So just a comment about, we can sometimes sort of compartmentalize the fact that this is going on in other parts of the world, thinking that the federal government or the military should take care of this problem. I think that comment is that this is as much all of our problem. Anyone that works in this industry, the operators and management, boards of directors, anybody working in this industry, it's your problem just as much as it is the federal government's or the military's.
If I could just add, Tom, and attribute another statement that Tom always says, the electricity sector is about 7% of the US GDP, but we're the first 7%. And don't mean that pejoratively, but think about, again, without electricity, everything else that gets affected, right? And while the electricity sector is certainly dependent on other critical infrastructure sectors, the reliance on electricity really is paramount, and that's why we have to continue to focus on this.
There is no question the cost of if an adversary were able to penetrate operational technology, et cetera, and shut down a portion of the grid, would have immense cost for that region. But there's also the cost of preventing against that. And I know, Richard, this is something that your organization, I think, is particularly concerned with, and you have some context as a former state regulator. How advanced, how happy are you with the state of the discourse on that subject of balancing cost versus protection and not gold plating the system.
Right. Well, always the issue of cost has to be first and foremost for regulators, particularly the economic regulators, and the industry needs to be mindful of what it means to a customer's bill, and we've got all the other investments we were talking about earlier today. So there's a lot to digest. But I have said, and New Jersey, the BPU in New Jersey, when I was the chairman, we were the first public utility commission in the country to issue a cybersecurity specific board order to require the engagement and investment by the industry in these matters. And I looked at it, and as I do today, and as I do with our group Protect Our Power, and say that the cost of not doing this, not including these protective measures and the measures to respond and recover are going to be more if we fail to do that. So it does have to be balanced. It can't be gold-plated. It's got to be prudent, but it is prudent to make these investments, quite frankly, whether it's in cybersecurity or in physical security, because the alternative, the cost of not doing it is worse. And I, as a former regulator, am regularly encouraging my former colleagues, the current commissioners, to be prudent, but also to look very actively at these issues. And there are a number of states that have, there are case studies of the commissions looking very particularly, but making very good decisions about these kinds of investments that need to be made in the system.
If I can add, I think you hit on a really great point there, because you need to do the planning. Everything is less expensive if you have planned in advance, right? Bolting it on is not the way that we want to do security. Secure by design is something that we take very seriously in CSER, because the earlier you plan and the earlier you design in the security, the less expensive it's going to be. And that goes all the way through the manufacturer. So we have programs like Citrix, which looks at the supply chain risk. If you are adding these components into your system, it is a lot better to know that you've done your due diligence, that you've designed your system, that you're buying from suppliers that you can trust. And that is going to be a huge cost savings than finding out you have an issue later, finding out you have a vulnerability, and now you have to spend a lot of taxpayer money, whatever, customer money, whatever your particular situation is, to fix a solution that would have been a lot cheaper to address early.
Manny, I know that in E-ISAC you're not involved in standards development nor in enforcement. But Rob is not here, so can you opine at all as to kind of the culture within NERC as to how it looks at costs?
Oh, I think it's the same way Richard described it, right? It is not cost for cost's sake, right? And gold plating everything really doesn't make any sense. So a good example of this, FERC recently ordered us to take a look at the physical security standard, SIP 14, Critical Infrastructure 14, which really talks about the physical protections around bulk power substations, right? And what people were concerned with is, all right, the easy answer will be here, apply everything to every station, and everybody, by the way, just protect everything. That really is not very prudent and doesn't make any sense, and at the end of the day would drive up costs without really buying down the risk. Right? So taking a much more risk-based approach, understanding where the exposures are, and then really having a discussion about the sort of no-regrets moves that we can make. And it's not just physical protection, right? It can be everything from designing the grid differently. It could be the introduction of renewables and battery storage. It could be a bunch of things, right, that start to do that in a secure way, as Mara just said, right? Don't put it there if it's not secure, but I think those are things, and so that's our approach. Adding cost, arbitrarily, we're not invested in doing that.
Rich, Manny and Mara, right? The sooner you think about security, the better off you are, and the more cost savings there are. You cannot secure everything, but the more you think about security when you're planning things, when you're looking at vendors, look at the vendors, but also look at the people that they're hiring. Look at the security protocols in those vendors. Look at that from an insider threat perspective, from a counterintelligence perspective. Look about the people that are being hired for security for these substations. Look at that physical security. So you have to look at everything, and the sooner you do it, the more cost savings are appropriated for that. Security is not a revenue-generating piece of cyber or energy in particular, but it is critical. So.
and I think it's an important item to note. So John's going to show up when you have a bad day, right? Like if John's showing up,
Hopefully
you got a
not,
bad day. But the level to which it is a bad day can be very, very different, right? So as Manny was saying, the resiliency of your system, are you going to have a little bad day because you're able to fix it quickly, it doesn't cause catastrophic failure because you've thought about the design in advance, you've thought about what that impact is, and you're able to recover quickly. And I think that's another important component as you tackle these issues is how much can you assume that something is going to go wrong and make sure it doesn't go wrong very badly.
Let's talk about the physical security, because the number of physical attacks has increased markedly over the last couple of years. Has this changed the way you perceive the vulnerability of the grid to physical attacks? And have we responded sufficiently to address that? We'll start with John.
I don't think it's changed the way we perceive the physical security of this. We've seen an increase in the attacks. We've seen an increase in, I guess, chatter among groups to look at these because of the media coverage. Obviously, it invites copycats. They've seen, power being taken down to 60,000 people. They're like, oh, that creates an impact. That gets our message out. That puts us at the forefront. But like we've already said, you can't gold plate everything. You can't bulletproof everything in the system. So you have to pick and choose kind of where you're going to put your money. Just obstructing the view of things and knowing your architecture is key. So where are the crown jewels? If you can't protect them, you can hide them. It doesn't have to be a great investment. CISA put out a product on their website last month, specifically talking about hardening power substations, and listed out a number of different things that are not very expensive to do. Just maintaining a fence around and having signage and making sure that there's no vegetation near those fences offers you better sight lines for your closed TV so you can monitor things. It's not very expensive to hire someone to come and trim some bushes back.
Yeah, I would agree. I don't think it's necessarily changed our outlook on this, but it's again, probably provided an opportunity to take a fresh look at, are there other things that we could do? And I'll just, one, I'm an IT guy and I'm a big sports fan, so I can't help myself when it comes to statistics. But we've looked at this. So we've looked at the physical security incidents that have been reported to the E-ISAC over the last 3 years. So about 4,200, 4,300 incidents. The vast majority are not grid impacting, right? Meaning that they're petty theft, break-ins, vandalism, stuff like that. Unfortunately, 3% of them have been resulted in grid impacts. And by grid impact, I mean a contingency, meaning an operating contingency to the system, or outages, as we saw in Moore County, right? So while 3% is a small number, we take no pleasure in people losing lights, and I think it provides an opportunity to think about, well, what should we be focused on? The SIP standards are focused on protecting the bulk power system, but should we look more deliberately at the loss of distribution load, right? And are there things that you could do to sort of further mitigate that? So it's important now to also in terms of the statistics and the trends. What we have seen is a marked increase over the last year in incidents, right? So of those 40-something hundred that I mentioned, over 1,700 or close to 1,700 were just in 2022, right? Same level of impact, about 3% being grid impacting. We've seen, and we don't have an exact correlation, but seem to spike around election cycles, right? We saw a spike in 2020 during the presidential election. We saw another spike in 2022 at the midterm elections, right? So what that's being, we don't know a lot about attribution because, as you know, there hasn't been many apprehensions here. So is it the work of extremists that are being driven by some political or other ideology? That we don't know, but we just need to continue to focus on it.
Yeah, you mentioned that in some of these cases there have been no apprehensions. I think the Duke case, the PG&E shooting several years ago. We did have a recent incident with neo-Nazi ex-prison inmate and a woman acquaintance who were arrested by the FBI and the Department of Justice, had planned to attack 5 substations, Baltimore Gas and Electric. We also had an incident a year ago where 3 white supremacists were arrested again before they were able to carry out an attack. In these 2 cases, these appear to be relatively small groups, not necessarily affiliated with larger organizations. Are you, and you mentioned, John, that you're hearing more chatter, and Manny also, but how much is this really just a few lone wolves, or as opposed to, are you seeing any evidence of truly organized activity to try to bring down a section of the grid?
I think as a whole, we're not seeing like an organized effort. The grid itself is a natural target just because it's visible. It's got a huge surface, for attack, and it's locally available. They don't have to travel far. But if you're asking for a concerted effort, amongst multiple groups and something along those lines, I don't believe we're seeing something like that.
Yeah, I would agree. No evidence to think that is a concerted effort. I think the one thing I would say, it is, when you look at all these extremist groups or groups that are driven by a particular ideology, it is a consistent arrow in their quiver, and that is attacking critical infrastructure, right? So whether it is electricity or some other critical infrastructure sector, that's part of their playbook.
Morton, do you have anything to add on that point?
I think it actually has been quite well covered. I do think that it is important to make sure that we have good data. So the more you communicate what you are seeing and making sure that reporting goes in, we're working on ways to better partner with local law enforcement. So that if you make a phone call to your local law enforcement, that they're recognizing those trends and understand to make sure that it comes back to the federal government so we can see if there are any trends going on. But I think that's really the last piece of the puzzle, is that we know what we know, but making sure that our industry partners also communicate what they're seeing fully so that we can have a better picture too.
Now, I know in the wake of the Baltimore incident, Calvin Butler, the CEO of Exelon, said that they conducted some exercises to determine what the impact would have been and how they could respond to it, in part by pre-positioning transformers, et cetera. Can any of you speak to the actual threat that these people thought that if they took down these 5 substations surrounding Baltimore, that it would have a significant impact on the grid in that area? I would think 5 substations would put a dent in things. But can you comment on any of that, Manny?
Yeah, it's hard to say, so that's also, no doubt, when you think of just the number, you would think 5 substations could have some sort of impact. But without getting into all of it, right, the sequence, the equipment that's impacted, all weighs in, and there's so many variables there that it is really hard to conclude, what could have taken place. But, suffice to say, probably some outages, had they successfully been able to compromise each of those 5 stations. But really hard to say that conclusively.
Rich, can I just add on there, because you sort of hit on a point that comes back to this issue about really a risk analysis. It's a facilities and risk analysis. And any enterprise, whether, and Calvin Butler's right. I mean, obviously they looked at that. They did some modeling, if you will, or some anticipation of this. But that's what everyone should be doing, looking at their own physical plant, their own systems, what's critical, do that analysis, and make sure that the operations folks are talking with their chief risk officer, and by extension, when we talk about the other threats, the CISO or the IT folks, it's a risk analysis. So whether it's a risk analysis of their operations and the physical threats, or whether it's something else, that's really, at the end of the day, what has to be done. And that's the way people should look at it, not any one particular threat.
And you mentioned the word exercise, right? Exercising is key, and exercising to truly understand your gaps. Don't exercise to believe that your playbook is perfect, right? Push the boundaries, try and bring in outside people to challenge the way you do things, to challenge the way you're thinking so that you can anticipate what happens and adjust those gaps, right? So we at CSER do a lot with publishing exercise resources, tabletop resources, trainings, and other sorts of things. And we do so in partnership with many of our partners across the federal, state, local governments. And leverage those resources, right? You don't have to do it alone. If you have questions, there's plenty of people who want to reach out and support you. And I also think that's a nice attribute of the energy sector in general is this, nobody wants a bad day to happen to one of their partners, right? Even if on a day-to-day basis there might be competition, when it comes to security, there is a partnership in that, and leveraging what your other businesses who are sitting in this room know, those are things that are really important, and that's not something to compete on.
And if I could, I would just really underscore that exercising is so important, and as Mara said, exercising with your stakeholders, with law enforcement, local law enforcement, especially in the context of the physical security threats. So you're not doing that for the first time. And Todd mentioned GridX earlier. This is a drill that we conduct every 2 years that we try to break the grid. We really come up with some pretty scary scenarios. And I can assure you this year we'll have a big focus on physical security as well, too, to do that. So it's a great opportunity to exercise your own response plans. We give you the scenario. You can tweak it however you want. So if you need more information on how to get involved on that, don't hesitate to reach out. And then we also do what we call an executive tabletop, where we bring in the leaders of the electricity industry as well as the leaders of the federal government and have those tough conversations about what would we do? What are the restoration priorities? What other considerations do we have? What's our communication to all our customers, our local governments, stuff like that. So I have a headache at the end of the day, but it's a very valuable exercise in terms of, learnings that we get out of it.
Manny, you mentioned in our prep call that you thought the industry, the electric industry, has learned from the federal government in regards to physical security. Can you elaborate on that a little bit?
Yeah, sure. Look, the federal government, and I'm sure Mara and John can speak to this better than I could, but have a lot of critical infrastructure that they need to protect, right? So whether it's the PMAs or power plants that they operate, critical defense infrastructure, military bases, other key government installations, right? They have very mature security practices that we could learn from as well, too. And that's been part of the stuff. John mentioned, CISA putting out some guidelines regarding substations. Well, earlier this year, we also published what we call the Physical Security Resource Guide, which referenced the CISA materials, DOE materials. And again, there's been a lot of information. We didn't just wake up to the fact that physical security is a threat. So there's a lot of great information about how to conduct risk assessments, what, are sort of prudent, no regrets sort of investments that you can make. To do that. So that's available on our website, and you can look at that. But that was developed with the industry, right? Just wasn't the E-ISAC.
We've mentioned once or twice, I think, supply chain. So let's turn to that as a risk, which certainly the significance of that was certainly demonstrated in mid-2020 with the SolarWinds incident, which this was malware hidden in software update for network management systems. How successful have we been since then in addressing supply chain risk? What have we accomplished and what needs to be done yet?
Do you want to go first?
Yeah, you can go.
I would say we have, so that is particularly on cyber supply chain, right? Because we have availability supply chain issues and cyber threat supply chain. And I would say there's been a lot of focus on that. The federal government has put in many practices for our own systems, as Manny was saying. There's a lot of things that, like, if you're gonna, eat the vegetables, you gotta eat the vegetables first yourself. And so we have a lot of practices that we are putting in place. There's a lot of standards that are being worked on, a lot from there's an executive order on supply chain that is being worked on. And so I think that there's a lot of effort. Have we solved the problem? No. Because there's always a concern. Knowing your suppliers, knowing what you need to have in your contract language, making sure you understand not only who you're buying from, but who they employ, who's coming in and doing the maintenance work on it, what access they have to your systems, as John was saying earlier. Those are all key learnings. And there's many, I think that the information and communications technology groups have really put a concerted effort into it. They're understanding that risk. And in our industry here, most of what we do has that component in it, right? Do you know when you go install something that by default, even if you didn't put it in your spec, it might have a router connected into it? Are you looking at all the components into it? Are those there and you're checking against what you actually want? What kind of relationship do you have with your suppliers about that? And I think those are the key attributes, and making sure you ask those tough questions, and that's a cultural norm to ask those tough questions. There's resources available on CISA's website. They have the Information Communications Technology Supply Chain Risk Management Task Force, which is an excellent resource. Even though it's targeted to the ICT community, any sector can use it. So there's a lot going on in this space that I think we can continue to challenge. We also, as I mentioned earlier, we have our Citrix program, which is digging into that supply chain understanding of the components that are affecting the energy sector.
Yeah, if I could, I'd add to, when you look at the supply chain sort of issue, particularly in the cyber context, it seems like an overwhelming, daunting issue that we'll never solve, right? But that's really not true, right? So good cyber hygiene, best practices, good password policies, the use of multi-factor authentication, segmenting networks, the principles of least trust or zero trust, right? They actually go a long way towards helping protect against them, right? But it's important to remember, going back to what I said earlier about the capabilities of the nation states, what they've done is they've solved the one-to-many problem. So instead of attacking each one of you, they attack a vendor that you all use, and now they have an entree into your network, right? That will continue to happen. That's another tool in each of their playbooks, right? And when you think about it in terms of bang for the buck, it's pretty smart, right? That's what they're trying to do. So, but making sure you have the protections across the network, right? Don't allow access into your OT networks arbitrarily. I mentioned remote access and multi-factor authentication. And again, as Mara said, all this has been, the government has put out a great deal of information about what you can do to protect yourself. CISA just also recently published cyber performance goals. And if you haven't seen them, take a look at them. They're really good, based on well-known frameworks that sort of help help mature programs and are really, again, no regrets sort of moves that you can take.
And I'll actually add, and we were just talking about this before we came up, is the need for cyber baselines and partnering with our state regulators, right? So much of the on-the-ground effort is in the state regulator forum, and so making sure that we from the Department of Energy, from CSER, are ensuring that those that are making the day-to-day decisions have the knowledge and the tools and the skill sets to make good decisions in those realms, and also even to the case of evaluating rate cases. If you do have to spend more funding in order to get a more secure component, how is that going to be read and factored in? And so I think that might be an interesting topic to discuss.
Yeah, and if I could follow up, just within the last couple of weeks, a new initiative was announced by the National Association of Regulatory Commissioners with DOE and CSER as the lead funding agency to work on an effort which, at this point, just to be real clear, and I think most of you may know this, the states, across the states, there are no adopted standards for cybersecurity in the energy, electric, let alone the rest of the utility sector. And there are no standards established on the equipment. And much of this equipment is going to the grid edge, that digitized equipment. This is an effort and I'm pleased to have been asked to be on the task force to help embrace some recommendations on a series of best practices for standards that can then be implemented by public utility commissions, which should then lead hopefully to a discussion and this group looking at standards for devices, which does have to happen as well. And the federal government and the DOE particularly has done a great job. The Biden administration's worked very diligently on those issues. But that's the bulk power system, right? The federal government has that jurisdiction. The states still lag behind in this, and particularly with what's coming on the grid edge, that is necessary to embrace some standards, both across the system and then for the devices.
Okay, we've got some questions from the audience. Let me tee this one up. What policy standards would you all like to see industry undertake to strengthen their respective security postures as the grid becomes more connected?
So if I might start in that, one of the things that the Department of Energy is working on right now in collaboration with our stakeholders is cybersecurity for the distribution system. And this is a report. We have hired NREL, one of our national labs, to convene various stakeholders to understand that change, right? How is our distribution system changing? And with that comes the follow-on is, what are those gaps that need to be addressed? There's some things that do have some standards. We just heard there's many attributes that don't have standards today when it comes to cybersecurity, and particularly a lot of the components that get integrated into the system. And how are you going to distinguish when you're procuring those items that you're buying a component that has had that secure by design contemplated as you go to make your selection?
And this morning, one panel was talking about the evolution of the technology, AI, data flowing with the electrons. Well, it's going to be a whole different engineering of the system. It's going to be two-way power flow. There's going to be balancing that's needed, dispatch, that we have now never done. Virtual power plants, 22 at FERC order 2222 with aggregated load and the dispatch of it. Those systems are being built right now. And a concern I have is, will we build into it, when we build these systems, the cybersecurity that's necessary to protect that new two-way power flow? That in and of itself is a huge undertaking.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
I think I'd reinforce and all the things that Richard and Mara said. I think it's important that we continue to look. And Mara said it earlier, let's do things prospectively, not retrospectively, because that's going to cost a lot more. So as we introduce renewables and interconnected devices, let's try to build security and reliability into it up front. But the two other things I'd point out is information sharing, right? And this came up in the National Cyber Strategy, and there is legislation regarding critical incident reporting. You know, we can help to inform what that is, but a real grassroots way of doing that is by sharing information, right? And so I'll make a gratuitous plug for the E-ISAC. If you're not a member of the E-ISAC, please do join. It's free. You know, we are not just the traditional utility asset owner and operator. We have a large concentration of generators, solar, wind, and would love to have more because that's where the grid is going, right? And what you're seeing from a security perspective is important and can help inform how we move forward, right? So I'd underscore the need to sort of focus on that as we go forward. The last thing, and it was also part of the strategy, is when you look at the diversity of rules or standards across critical infrastructure, is there an opportunity to sort of, I hate this word, but I'll say it, harmonize in terms of looking across critical infrastructure to say what makes sense across the board, right? And see what we could do there.
John, I don't know if you want to opine on standards.
As Mara said, I'm only there for the bad day. Policy is not really our forte, but we do go out and we do see from time to time, obviously, when we conduct our investigations, why do you have things set up this way? Why is it built this way? You know, we ask a lot of questions. That's what we're good at. And a lot of times there's no standard for it, or it was the cheapest option, when it comes to the contract. So, as both Manny and Mara said, building security in when you're thinking about these, and then leveling the standards would be key to making sure that we don't have to show up on that bad day.
Yeah, and I think making sure that those that don't feel that they're part of the standards conversation come into the fold. Standards are coming, standards are necessary in so many different regards, and making sure that your voices, regardless of where you are part of that conversation, so that as they are written, they're reflective of the real world that we live in. It is no use providing a standard that no one can implement, that no one can achieve, that is written for a niche section of the people who actually just showed up to the discussions. So making sure that diverse voices are heard in the standards making is critical, especially as we break new ground, right? So much of our electrical grid especially is changing, and how we have the generation is really changing. And so we need to make sure that those that are part of that change are engaging in the conversation as much as those who have been engaging in the past.
Great, thanks. We have another question here, and I think I can answer the first part of the question myself, which the answer
You can
is
answer
very.
the second part if you want to.
The answer is very. How important are vulnerability scans or assessments? So I think we would all agree they're very important. But how often should they be done? I know that GridX is performed every other year, I believe, right, Manny? Should utilities be doing drilling on a monthly, quarterly basis on their own?
Yeah, look, I think there is a risk-reward part of that question. I think you should do them as frequently as you think you need to do them, or where there is a perceived gap, where you think you could learn from that. I think the more important thing is, how do you monitor things, right? And you can't really monitor, or you can't protect what you don't know or can't see, right? So, in 2021, the Biden administration instituted this 100-day sprint for the electricity sector, which called for the implementation of monitors in operational technology networks. We've done a decent amount of that, and we've been sharing and looking at that data and actually using that data to analyze for the threats that I talked about earlier. But that could be done, I think, much more pervasively, right? And I think that's the sort of, we got to get to a point where and not necessarily at every utility or installation, but where we're leveraging data, and we had somebody talk about AI before. This is the power of AI. You could look at huge amounts of data and start to think about what is malicious behavior, what are the bad guys trying to do for us. So that's another opportunity, I think, as we go forward.
Richard, do you have any observations on that?
I would agree with Manny. I don't think there's any one answer to that. It's what the people should look inward to their own operations, decide whether there are gaps or particular areas that they need to do those exercises and go through that analysis. I don't think there's one answer to it, but look inward, talk to the staff, make sure you're working across the entirety of the enterprise, as I said, operations through risk, through IT and facilities. Those are the kinds of things you have to do on some regular basis. Here's the only other thing that I would say is that, and Mari has sort of alluded to it, which is once you do the exercises, once you do that analysis or business continuity review, implement the change. There are plenty of stories out there about people going through the exercise, oh yeah, we missed this gap, and never implemented in their manuals or playbooks the fix. Make sure that gets done.
Very good point. Is the growth of the Internet of Things increasing the attack vector beyond what can be managed, or do we need to look at AI to help monitor the system?
That is quite a hefty question.
Hey, I didn't write it.
So I do think, I will try and segment that question a little bit.
Go ahead.
The Internet of Things is having a big impact in how our energy systems move, right? We talked about the two-way draw. You have, the massive cars with these massive batteries that could be drawn upon in a time of power shortage. That changes the dynamic. And as Manny was saying, the information sharing, making sure that the data exchange is secure and knowledgeable, regardless of what Internet of Things connections are part of it, is key. Know what data is getting transferred, know who has access to it, only share what you need to, right? Manny and I might be sharing information, but he doesn't have to see the whole kit and caboodle. He has got to see the part that he needs to make decisions off of. And I think as you're evaluating how the Internet of Things is affecting you and your decisions and your company's operations, making sure you're asking those questions of yourself is really key, and not just for today's system, but many of the investments you're making are 5, 10, 15, 20 years out. So try and envision what the system will need to be then, because then you will be making more cost-effective decisions for the long run.
And seeing the glass half full, right? The Internet of Things is good, right? When you think about the societal benefits that it provides, right? But I think don't just look at it in the context of cybersecurity or security. Think about how we can enhance reliability and performance, right? We talked about dispatching load and things like that. That is the power of it, right? And the power of AI, right? And we're starting to develop technologies and tools that, or actually they've been developed, that we can leverage. But we'll learn more about as we do this, right? So it's not just in the context of security. It's, I think, looking at it broadly about the benefits it can provide.
I think both Manny and Mara pointed out too that anything's manageable. When you're looking at your particular case, I mean, it's very bespoke. Knowing your architecture is key. As we started the segment, we started going through the survey results. 2 or 3 of the survey results were, I don't know. That's very telling. So understanding your own architecture tells you when there is a problem. And understanding that it also points out where your vulnerabilities are. And again, as Manny said too, once we're doing these exercises, these grid X's, we're all sitting at the table because we're all sharing information. We're bringing in real-world stuff from investigations and making them as real as possible and trying to break the grid and learning from that and then going out and saying, hey, this is what you need to do to avoid this. And if we take X off the table and we take Y off the table, we become more resilient.
One other thing that I think is important to note, these are control systems that we're talking about, just like a control system in a power plant or a substation, right? But if you thought about some battery management platform or electrification platform, one simple thing that can be done, don't connect it directly to the internet and leave it wide open for the attackers to just walk in, right? That's a simple, no regret sort of thing that can be done to sort of, and it may sound obvious, but getting back to what we've discussed here, sometimes we see those sort of things, right? But as we go forward, those are the things that we really can't tolerate.
Kind of a related question. The self-healing grid was a concept a few years ago. Is that still a viable option to isolate areas of breach or attacks and minimize grid impacts?
So I would argue, and I've been in this industry a really long time, the grid is self-healing. It already is, right? Now, that doesn't mean that there couldn't be more resilience and redundancy, and even what I just talked about is we're introducing more renewables and other assets. How do we think of that or continue that self-healing paradigm, right? But the sector or the grid is highly resilient across North America, right? As a matter of fact, the standards do a great job in terms of facilitating that resilience, right? And again, not declaring victory, but it's an important thing to note that we're not figuring it out. We've actually figured it out and just need to improve on it.
Richard, your organization about a year ago identified its 4 priorities for 2022. I haven't seen a new list of priorities, but they included encouraging investments in cybersecurity and grid resilience, related to incentives and cost recovery mechanisms, and providing federal funds for municipal power and electric cooperatives that may not have that kind of funding. Second is a national testing structure for grid hardware and software. Third was a best practices database to facilitate information sharing among buyers and sellers of cybersecurity products. And then the fourth was expansion of separate, more secure communication systems exclusively devoted to mission-critical power system operations. What kind of progress have we seen on any of those fronts in the last year?
Well, there's been progress on many of them. We talked a little bit about the federal government and the device issues and where we're going and where the industry is starting to embrace those. So that's very positive. And on cost recovery, I mentioned them earlier, there's a recognition that there needs to be these investments, which I'm very pleased that conversation is going on, particularly at the state level. There will have to be more of that. And like I said earlier, I'm always a champion for supporting the folks that are in those commissions that got to make those tough decisions. There's one area, though, of those priorities that you mentioned, there are two actually that still trouble me, is this gap between the states not really having in place the standards and the engagement. That's hopefully coming. On secure communications, and we mentioned it here just a few minutes ago, but that is something that often gets overlooked. In the midst of a crisis, of an outage, something that's wide scale, is the fact that there is communications that may be tied to it, oftentimes wireless, that fails as well. There needs to be redundant communications for the purposes of an energy company and the responders, government, to be able to communicate in the event of a wide-scale outage. That's one area that often gets overlooked. I would also recommend that everybody go back and ask their folks in their own shop, do they have that ability to do out-of-band communications if their regular communication systems fail?
Okay, we're almost out of time, but I wanted to leave one more question with John here. Tell us how the FBI is organized for cybersecurity. Are you set up regionally or locally? How would, if somebody needed to find an FBI agent to talk to about this, aside from calling you?
Don't call me. We have obviously agents and squads that do cyber security investigations at all of our field offices. There's 56 field offices in the country. Also, we have them stationed over as cyber ALATs around the world to work with partners around the world. Obviously, the cyber threat knows no bounds, so obviously we have to take that into account by positioning people where they are, where you can be met. So if you don't know your cyber SSA at your field office, it's not a bad idea when you go home to pick up the phone and give them a call. They will take your call, set up a meeting. They'll probably be having engagement events as well to bring your companies in. And it's, as we said before, it's better to have a friend before you need a friend.